And for a grand total of 1 week, I was the best-selling poetry author in all of Oceania. Wow! Let me start by acknowledging that we are on indigenous land, always was, is, and always will be. And I do that not perfunctorily, but because I genuinely believe that we have much to learn by listening to our indigenous people and respecting their culture, including in ways that I'm going to try to illustrate today. Yeah, I do write a bit of poetry, but I really dream of being a movie director. So, with that in mind, I'm going to grab a couple of volunteers to start this presentation and direct you a little bit in a bit of role play. Lady in the white jacket, she put her hand up before I pointed to her. Could you come forward? Thanks. And your name is? Bria. Bria, okay. Is that on? I hope so. And I need to jump. Costa, come on. There we go. Okay. All of us have been in this situation, whether it's Martin Place in Sydney, or whether it's the Queen Street Mall in Brisbane, or whether it's the walking thoroughfares in Adelaide or any place else, yeah? Where there's a young, attractive backpacker, inevitably, and she's wearing some sort of t-shirt. She's wearing some sort of t-shirt that is for some sort of good cause, okay? Let's make this good cause kids' leukemia. Anybody opposed to kids solving leukemia amongst kids? Okay, fine. So you are the fundraiser to get some money together so we can help kids with leukemia. Costa, you are a really, really busy waste industry executive. You've got about 450 emails in your phone. You're rushing towards a meeting. You really need to get there. There's a big deal that you have to make. You've got absolute empathy for people with leukemia. You have absolute empathy with kids.
Yeah, I'm important.
Okay, so here we go. Bria, start the fundraising. Go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted to talk to you about leukemia.
Yep.
It's really important.
What's that? Yep.
Excuse me.
Sorry, what do you want?
Oh, I just wanted to talk to you about leukemia. It's a really huge issue.
Yeah, I agree, but look, I've got to go. They're after me at the office.
Perfect. Thank you, volunteers. Okay. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Well played, both actors. Academy Awards, no doubt. How many of you have seen that conversation? Why? Why does that conversation take place the way it is? Why did the busy business executive, even though he cares about kids' leukemia, simply walk past a completely reasonable request from the fundraiser? Somebody tell me. Tell you. Because we know exactly where that conversation is going. We know that it would have ended with the request for some sort of fundraising. And as much sympathy and empathy as we may have had for that request, we've got all these other things going on in our lives. We're busy, we're distracted, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, we just walk past. Not because we're bad people, but because it's within a framework of expectations that we're so used to that we simply ignore it. What we in the resource sector are coping with now is the opposite. The conversation is changing. We heard it already today. There's disturbance. The conversation is changing. So the great risk and opportunity for the companies that I represent, 30-odd recycling and resource companies, and for the people that we work for in this room, is to actually hear that new conversation that's taking place in society and how it impacts on and what implications it has for our businesses and for the people that our businesses serve. So, they read off the CV. I've spent about the last 8 years in politics and in polling and working at Lifeline. And what that is all about is listening. Trying to figure out where people are coming from, trying to figure out what is the societal trend here that we need to be respectful of. So what I want to do today is talk to you about 4 mega trends as I see them that we need to consider And at the end, because it's topical, I'm also going to talk a little about the crisis in recycling, if you will. So because I'm an old pollster, let's continue the questions, right? Here we go. Everybody, put your hands on your devices. I'm serious. Put your hands on the devices that you have with you now. Put them in the air. Okay, let's do this a different way. Put them all down. The people who have no devices with them right now, raise your hand. Wow. Okay, so just keep on remembering these things. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'm going to comment on the social trend that perhaps is underscored. Secondly, how many of you are not using the conference app? So that's about 10%, 15%. Interesting. How many of you have played with, installed, are thinking about getting one of those groovy new vacuum cleaners that goes around your house when you're not at home? Yeah, admit it, okay. About 10, 15%. How many of you have also played around with, thought about, maybe even bought already an Alexa or one of those other devices that you say, turn on the air conditioning, turn on the music, et cetera, et cetera? Come on, fess up. Again, about 20 or 30%. Okay, so let me give you some facts and some statistics about this whole realm of devices and what I call robotification, a trend called robotification. So for example, the industry known as the Internet of Things, devices that are somehow connected to the internet, gather data, do things that you want them to do using data, like turn on the fridge or turn on the air conditioning, et cetera, right now in Australia is worth about $4 billion. An average home right now has about 14 internet-enabled devices. Secondly, on a world basis, you're looking at about something like 8.4 billion Internet of Things devices right now, and that's 30% up from last year. So you've seen a growth of something like 2 billion devices in simply 1 year on an international basis. Starting to hear where I'm going with? Every day you wake up and you see another news story about autonomous vehicles and Elon Musk, et cetera, et cetera. Every day you click on Instagram and you look down at photographs taken by drones and you hear stories about how drones are going to deliver pizzas, et cetera, et cetera. They're already doing a lot more than that. I have a mate who's very fortunate. He owns a vineyard up in Mudgee. He sits at home, he looks at his computer screen, and his drone flies his vineyard and looks for botrytis on individual vines that he can then email his manager to say, I need you to go spray vine X, Y, and Z. So robotification isn't just something that's going to happen in the future. It's happening right now. So let's consider, what does that mean for us as an industry and for yourselves as people who are part of that industry? So first of all trends cut both ways, yeah? There's good parts of it and there's bad parts of it. So on the one side, you're going to see a great deal more of what you might call smart machines in our industry. That's machines that do things like move waste automatically and move resources automatically. Driverless vehicles are a reality, folks, and we're going to have to deal with it, whether we like it or not. Secondly, machines that more automatically process waste. And I'm not just talking about optical sorters here in MRFs, et cetera, et cetera. I'm talking about things like Apple, who in the last month has released news of, for example, a recycling machine that completely, without using any human contact, can take up to 200 mobile phones in an hour, completely strip them and mine them for the resources that are inside them. Yeah? Whether it works or not, Rose Reed from MRI can tell us and others can tell us, but at least that's the trend. And obviously, lots more smart machines that are in the business of measuring waste. I went around and I looked at the stalls, and something like 30% of the stalls out there are about software, apps, and other pieces of a technology that all are about measuring how much material there is, giving you good data, giving your customers good data, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just the thin edge of the axe, if you will. So That's the good news, is that suddenly we're going to have access to a whole lot more smart machines to make our lives and the lives of our customers simpler. But on the other hand, e-waste is growing at 3 times faster than any other waste stream in Australia. Batteries are growing at 300% per year. We now use 400 million batteries per year in Australia. Rose Reed is looking at me and checking my numbers. That's extraordinary. Anybody been to a MRF lately and looked at what's lying on the floors? E-waste, car batteries, handheld batteries. Massive boom in these things. And what is our policy response, by the way? Last Friday or Friday week before, Ministers for the Environment decided that they were going to, quote unquote, fast track a product stewardship program for batteries. They first put it on the list in 2013. We're currently reviewing the Product Stewardship Act as it applies to televisions. Our current policies don't cover anything else that's plugged in. And yet, that is the major phenomenon that's taking place in our society. Our rules and our reality are out of step. And the people who get caught in the middle are you folks as council folks who have to answer the phone to say, why can't I do that or that or that with my battery? And us who get it into our streams where it really makes a bad amount of difference in terms of the products that we're actually trying to create as contamination. So, robotification is trend 1. Okay, let's ask you some more questions about the second trend. From the time that you woke up this morning to the time that you got to this hall, have a guess how many messages of any kind of variety that you may have seen. Billboard, radio, stuff happening out there in the hall. Just a guess. How many messages do you reckon you took in? Couple of hundred. Who would go higher? Who would go lower? Higher. Hands up in the air, higher. 500? Keep your hand up. 500? 1,000? It's actually about 2,500. Okay? In a day, a typical Australian sees about 10,000 communication messages of one variety or another variety. So 2,500 from the time you woke up until the time you got here this morning, right? Now let me ask you another question. Of those 2,500 messages that each and one of you saw, so let's take 2,500 times how many people in this hall? Greg Freeman, maybe 400 people in this hall. You know the numbers. Somebody, one volunteer, I'm serious. Tell me one message that you remembered today. Come on. Steve? Speed camera. Why did you remember that?
Because I know where it is and I drove past it on the way in.
Absolutely. Completely personally relevant, right? There was a risk involved, therefore he notices the message. Anybody else? One message. Sorry? Trump tore up the Iran deal. Interesting. How many others saw that Trump tore up the Iran deal today? But none of you remembered it when I asked you. Okay, next question. And this is going someplace. How many of you want to spend your dotage, your final years in a nursing home? Come on, hands in the air. Who wants to spend their life in the nursing home? Nobody wants to go to a nursing home. Come on. Okay. Next question. Right now, here as we sit, we're going to be really honest with each other. How many of you feel, be real honest, just a little bit lonely? I do. I feel real lonely up here. It's a hard one for people to put their hands in the air. I asked people to do it anonymously when I was at Lifeline. We did a national survey, 3,600 respondents. 65% of Australians reported that they regularly feel lonely. And it's okay to feel lonely. It's a normal emotion, but it gets a little bit toxic when it's not dealt with in the proper way. So what's my point here? This is a trend that I call Uberification, and I'll explain what I mean by Uberification right after I give you some stats around some of the questions that I've asked. 1 in 4 Australians are currently living alone. 25% of us live alone. That's higher than it's ever been. 65% I already told you feel lonely sometimes. The budget, you would have noticed yesterday, put huge amounts of money towards what? Towards health care for older people in their own homes. Because people are living that much longer and do not want to end up institutionalized. So how does this come together? On the one hand, we've talked about robotification. We've talked about a whole bunch of stats that I just gave you. We are more digitally connected than we have ever been. We have all these devices, and we have 7,000 friends on Facebook. And yet, when you look at the way we live, smaller housing units, living longer and alone, we're more physically and personally disconnected from people than we have ever been. And that has a geographical spectrum too, depending on whether you're in a metropolitan location or whether you're in a regional location. So, in physics, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So as we have this societal trend to become more disconnected, we also work harder as a society and individuals to find connection. And here, there's interesting aspects of resource recovery and recycling. So for example, at ACOR, 2 weeks ago, we did a survey of 1,000 Australians to ask them their feelings about recycling, even after China, even after Four Corners, even after the war on waste. And we found that 88% of Australians supported the improvement of recycling. So if you think about how do you get to 88% of Australians, that means that whether they were a coalition voter or a Labour voter or a Green voter, whether they lived in a city, they lived in a town, they lived on a farm, whether they were old or young, there is a unanimous consensus around this national institution called recycling. And it has so much goodwill as a result of all the work that all of us have done for 25 and 30 years, that even with that deserved bad publicity, it has that much equity in its brand. It's that strong as something that we really value. Why do we value it? Because it gives us connection. It gives us a sense of purpose. We talked about nature and its restorative quality and some truthing in that. And for urbanites, recycling is an extension of that concept. So how does that translate, for example, to the resource and recovery industry? This kind of contrary tension between we're more disconnected on the one hand by our devices, but we want more connection in our personal lives, right? So you see phenomena like free cycle, which is not dissimilar to some of the things that our guest from the UK was putting up, where people are getting together completely naturally, completely organically online, and exchanging goods and services. And the younger you go down the demographic, the more of this you see. You see things like what I call personal provenance, an interest in where my stuff comes from. In the United States, a very developed movement where you can buy shares in organic farms and then get guaranteed delivery of goods to your home from that farm in exchange for your share. This concept is now being extended to other goods, including packaging. So there is this amazing thing called the plastic bank, for instance, where you can basically, just like you offset your carbon credits, you can offset your plastic usage on a year. That money goes into a bank. That bank funds people in the third world to collect plastic, recycle it, return it in exchange for things like school uniforms, school fees, and why? To keep the plastic out of the ocean. People are funding this. People are taking an interest in what is my stuff made of? Is it recycled content or is it not recycled content? In that ACOR survey, we found more than 80% support for governments taking a more proactive role with regard to positive procurement. And by the way, that's local government too. We can't be a society that's just great at pushing things out. We have to be a society that's really good at pulling things through as well. We can't just be about one arrow of the Mobius. We also have to be about reprocessing and actually putting it back into new products. So that's Uberification. Next question. Anybody drive to Coffs Harbour? Okay, of those of you who drove, what did you typically pay for a liter of petrol? $1.48, $1.50? $1.42, you got a good deal, independent retailer. When did we get our last electricity bills? When did we get our last quarterly bills? Does anybody remember? When was it? I think it was 2-3 weeks ago or something like that, right? Who in this room was not shocked by their electricity bill when they got it last quarter? Ooh, that's not bad, about 50%. So, who in this room was a little bit, oh my Lord, we better turn off the flat screens? So, what trend is this pointing to? I call this trend resource security. Why have our petrol prices gone up to the degree that they have? We can have an argument about whether or not oil is or isn't a finite resource, and we can go back and forth on the science for a long time. But what we can't have an argument about is the political factors that impinge on our access to resources. Indeed, why are you looking at $1.50 worth of petrol? 2 reasons. One, a mad place called Venezuela that decides whether it will or won't produce oil for very arbitrary reasons, creating a shortage in the world. And perhaps a madder place called Russia, run by a really nice guy who decides that oil is a great way to basically fight the rest of the world who doesn't particularly like him. So we may not necessarily have a natural shortage of resources, but we certainly are seeing more and more signs of politically created shortages of resources and an inability to access those resources, on the one hand. And equally, when, for example, pollsters like my old self used to do surveys, what do you think is the #1 issue that comes up in polling for Australians? What do you think they are concerned about more than anything else? Think about last night's budget, and you can probably get a big clue. What do you reckon it is? Cost of living. Cost of living by threefold is always the #1 issue compared to everything else: health, education, environment, so forth and so on. So when you combine those things, lack of access to resources, price consciousness, you suddenly start to see that there's an implication for people in the waste and the resource recovery industry. Namely, that our activities start to fall into broader categories, not just diversion from landfill, but the whole dynamic around the production of energy, for instance, from what we do, become much more poignant. They don't just become a commercial strategy to say, oh, we can make a few more bucks by getting that residual off the floor. They become a social response to the fact that we can't access the resources that we need, to the fact that energy is too expensive. So one of the trends you're likely to see coming off the back of resource security, or the developments you're likely to see, is a greater emphasis on waste to energy. No one in the world, in their right mind, is going to stand here as an industry representative and say, we should supplant conventional recycling programs or supplant everything else we do in resource recovery with waste energy. Absolutely not. But certainly, there's good reason to consider why we should supplement those initiatives with a greater recovery of, for example, mixed plastics that we can't use out of a MRF into some higher order use like energy. Okay, and finally, a couple more questions. How many of you live in a flat? Okay, you're actually underrepresented. At the moment, we now have 1.2 million flats in Australia. 1 out of 5 dwellings in Australia is a flat. There's been a 78% increase in the last 25 years of people living in flats, and 40% of the flats that have been created in the last 3 years are over 4 stories high. How many of you are from metropolitan areas where you're in charge of recycling or waste management systems? How easy, and don't you love it, to try to get waste and recycling out of multi-unit dwellings? Isn't it the best thing ever? It's really, really hard. Moreover, how many of you love sitting in traffic on Saturday when you're trying to take your kids to soccer? So our cities are becoming much more dense and much taller, and that has massive implications for the waste and resource recovery industry. It means things like discussions around pneumatic transport of waste and recycling might come back into play. It means things like increased source segregation and bring strategies as opposed to take strategies. It means things like localized energy production from the materials that we recover from all of those big towers. All right? Okay. I'm going to give you one story about how all these trends come together, and then I'm going to spend 2 minutes on the curbside recycling crisis. Robotification, Uberification and taking control, resource security and wanting to get a bang for my buck in terms of my recycling activities, urbanization. 45 Macquarie Street, Parramatta. It's where I downsized with my wife and my 2 dogs, got rid of the kids. We live on the 23rd story now. We moved in last year together with everybody else. 400 flats in a 30-story building. Geniuses, they put in one of those chutes, yeah? And you're supposed to press a yellow button for it to go to recycling down the chute and a red button for it to go to rubbish. I hope none of those manufacturers are here because I'm about to insult you. I said to Susie, I give it a week before it stuffs up, literally stuffs up. It lasted for 4 days. So everybody starts going nuts. Can't do anything with the recycling. You know, we moved in because we thought there was a recycling system. Every modern building is supposed to have a recycling system, et cetera, et cetera. Building management goes away and says, oh, we've got the great solution for you. We'll give you a black crate. And everybody on the floor can put their stuff in a black crate. Okay, 15 units on every floor, black crate. Obviously, just more rubbish, doesn't work. Our building is probably 80% culturally and linguistically diverse. People from India, people from China, people from Malaysia, et cetera, et cetera. Doesn't work. How do these trends come together in our building? Well, those of us on the building management committee and a few other interested people, we've never actually seen each other personally, by the way. We've never physically met. We found each other all online, and we created our own community about how we're going to come up with a better recycling outcome at 45 Macquarie Street. And the recycling outcome that we came up with is we did a deal directly with our own cleaner, went around building management, and we've installed 2 40-liter yellow bins on every level with a rosette. So the only thing you can put in those bins is what? Container deposit material. He keeps half of it goes back to building management. So we did the calculations about how much we're going to get on a yearly basis. We're like, wow, that's just not a Christmas party for the building. We can do a lot. So sure enough, what are we doing with the money? We're setting up a forum inside the building about what we can do to swap and trade other reusable goods, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? Took control of our own waste management, took control of our own personal provenance, used technology, sought to become more connected to each other. Folks, these are the conversations that are happening out there as we speak. And we as an industry have to get smart about hearing them. Why did I start with an indigenous reference? Because there's a wonderful word called dadiri. Dadiri exists in many indigenous languages, but this one happens to be from northern Victoria. And dadiri means listening with deep intent. Wonderful word. And that is in part what we have to do with our audiences going in the future. We may be replaced by a robot. But one thing that a robot can't do is listen to a customer. Listen to a ratepayer. And that's the value add that our industry will increasingly be playing in the future, is providing the human and the heart element to a highly technical and digitized process. One word on the curbside recycling crisis. It's real, depending on where you are in the country, depending on what your contract is. Don't believe anybody who says it's not real. It is. It's hurting MRFs. Commodity prices have gone down by 50 to 80%, depending where they are. We're stuck in it together. We're all suffering as a result of a change to about 20 or 30% of our marketplace, yeah? So we can stay here all day long, you blaming us blaming you, about who's going to pick up the difference as a result of this commodity swing. It's pointless. What we need to do is 2 things. First of all, we need to join together for practical solutions. What does that look like, for instance? So ACOR, for instance, is going to be working with ALGA and other industry associations to come up with a set piece of communication around decontamination. One thing that we can all very quickly do is get the plastic bags out, get the food out, get the e-waste out, get the textiles out, regardless of the kind of system that we run. And we need to all join together and be on message on that, yeah? Secondly, there was mention of a national plan. National plan has actually been agreed to over the next 12 months by ministers. The question is what goes in that national plan? And there again, local government and our part of the industry need to come together. So for instance, the packaging guys have now said, good on them, all packaging is going to be recyclable by the year 2025. Terrific. I get it. That's a good goal. Who's going to do that? You? Us? So we need to get serious together about the proposal, for instance, that we've put up to invest $150 million into rebooting curbside recycling, including $90 million of infrastructure investment. We need to develop the capacity that the Chinese have always had. Let's not be pissed off at the Chinese. Let's be the Chinese. Let's create the domestic reprocessing capacity for paper, for mixed plastic, for the other materials that we're all collecting. Let's introduce the procurement policies that people are already telling us they want. They want to buy recycled content. So, if I have a call to arms to you today, ladies and gentlemen, use this conference to talk to each other. Use this conference to talk to people like industry from me to say, how do we join together to take that message to state and federal governments who control our destiny in this space, to say, yes, national plan, based on infrastructure, based on education. Thank you.